Now, from TV, your local news source, this is All Indiana Politics.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of All Indiana Politics on this Sunday. It's Indiana's premier Sunday morning political show. We want to start today with Indiana's Attorney General taking on Mark Zuckerberg. Todd Rakita says his office will investigate what he calls the Big Five tech companies: Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Amazon, and Google. Rakita wants to know if the companies have been censoring conservative viewpoints and violating Indiana law by doing it. It was just 2 months ago, you may recall, that Twitter added a warning label to a Rakita Valentine's Day tweet, one meant to look like a Valentine's Day card that read, "You stole my heart," like a 2020 election. Twitter eventually dropped that label.
Let's welcome in Attorney General Todd Rakita. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
You know, you say that big tech, including Facebook and Twitter, are censoring conservative content. How are they censoring that content?
Well, part of our investigation, the main part of our investigation, is going to look into that very thing. No lawsuit has been filed on this yet, but we're looking into whether or not they have violated Indiana's Deceptive Consumer Sales Act, right? By using abusive practices, deceptive or unfair practices to keep information from consumers, whether they're consumers of things that Facebook may have for sale, like a book that they've taken off their electronic shelf, or whether the consumer is trying to access and process political information so that they can make a decision about their government. It's all the same thing under the Deceptive Consumer Sales Act, and that's what we got to figure out and look into, is whether or not they're violating that act. So we have thoroughly asked them very specific questions, and we will continue that investigation.
You know, this is a big conversation. This is a pretty big conversation that I don't think 10 years ago we were thinking that we would be having, right? Because social media is so big. So big tech executives would say that they're stopping that false content. But should the tech companies be stopping content that is obviously false, or should they be marking that content as false?
Well,
that's more opinion.
Yeah, thank you for that. They shouldn't be the arbiters of truth at all. They shouldn't worry themselves really about that. They should let consumers decide by putting all the information out there. You know, that's what we're best at as Americans and as Hoosiers. We can determine the value of different products and different pieces of information ourselves if we're given all the information, and that's what the Deceptive Consumer Sales Act is meant to protect us against these barons.
Let's talk about the consequences, right? What do you hope to get from this investigation? What will be the consequences,
well, we'll
like criminal charges or civil suits? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't necessarily be my hope, because you got to go where the investigation leads. And the fact of the matter is, we've had several complaints, and our own observations tell us, and their admissions tell us, that they are keeping content from us. They are taking books off the shelves. I just had to write Jeff Bezos a letter about that a couple weeks ago. So we know they're doing that. The question is, what are the methodologies behind what they're doing? What are the motives? And we're going to discover that. And if it leads to practices that are violative of Indiana law, we're going to go after them.
And as far as civil suits, things like that?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I like to make it plain, right?
Sorry.
You know, let's talk about the foreign actors in this, because I feel like at kitchen tables all around Indiana, when we have this conversation, it's, well, who is doing that? Well, from which government are they from?
Right, that's a great question, yeah. Who's behind all this stuff? What are the methodologies? What are the algorithms? Who's preparing them? What is different from what they're saying they're doing from what they're actually doing? And our investigation aims to get to the bottom of what they're actually doing.
And you know, that's a big conversation when it comes to voters too, right? When people are hoping to do their research.
Yes.
But, you know, then this might come into play.
You know, time and time again, we all ask citizens to be involved to keep our country free. If you're going to run a free republic, you have to have citizen engagement. And so these citizens are honestly going out looking for resources, and they ought to be resources that give the full picture and let us decide what choice we want to make. That's part of being a consumer as well, when we consume political information.
What do you say to the folks that say, hey, that should be a federal decision, maybe not, you know, handled on the state level?
Well, if I saw the federal government doing it, you know, that might, you know, I might agree with them. But the fact of the matter is, we're not seeing the federal government doing it, and so I am.
So two other topics that I want to address with you before I have to let you go. The Indiana General Assembly is considering changes to the election laws. And, you know, that's very big news nowadays. Those changes that would limit the governor's power to expand vote by mail. We've also seen the controversy over Georgia's new voter laws. We've seen a lot of people have a lot of opinions on that. Does Indiana need to make changes to its election rules?
Well, I testified in favor of a bill that changed some of the rules, and basically it wasn't changing the rules. It was saying that our General Assembly, those people that we elect and that are closely accountable to us as voters, should be the ones making those changes. What we saw last fall, whatever side of that issue you feel you're on, is that there were last-minute changes to the rules of the process that were made by people who were not authorized to do so. They weren't elected by anybody. They might have been judges, which would be the last resort. And so we have to make sure the legislators, which is called for in our Constitution, that they do the job, are allowed to do it. So what the bill does, sponsored by or written by Senator Aaron Houchin, is make sure it codifies the fact that that's their job, the legislators.
You know, the House and the Senate have approved bills that would limit the powers during emergencies like the pandemic. One allows the legislature to call itself into special session. Do you believe that that bill is constitutional? And do you think that the governor's powers should be reduced in cases like what we saw last year?
Well, you know what, as your Attorney General, I represent the state. And the state is the state of the state, whether it's the General Assembly or the governor or what have you. So we're navigating those waters. We're seeing what laws actually do get passed, what gets vetoed, what gets veto overridden, if the veto gets overridden, et cetera, et cetera. So we're continuing to monitor that, and I can tell you this, the people elected me to be their legal voice, to be the state's legal voice, and I will do my job.
You know, I have to say, you know, there's been quite a few presidential elections and elections in general, but man, are we seeing people really get fired up about their voices being heard.
Yes, and that's what it's about. Have trust in the people. They will make the right decisions.
Attorney General, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
And we did reach out to Facebook about the investigation. A spokesperson for the company told us while we're not commenting on the investigation, Facebook has rules in place to protect free expression, and we continue to apply them impartially. Indiana Republican lawmakers want to change some of Indiana's election laws. Democrats compare it to what's happening in Georgia. But is that fair? The changes and the reaction next on All Indiana Politics. And welcome back to All Indiana Politics on this Sunday. We've seen a big week of action on a bill to make changes to Indiana's voting laws. A House committee approved a bill that bans the governor and election commission from changing the date of an election or expanding absentee vote by mail to everyone. Both happened in last year's primary. The bill would only allow the legislature to make those changes in the future.
But what we don't want to have is widespread changes statewide to extend voting hours, to have 100% vote by mail, to have changes that would disenfranchise potentially the voting electorate. It's our responsibility and duty to make sure through these types of processes that each person only has one vote.
Now, committee members did remove parts of the bill that required you to use either your driver's license or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number to get a mail-in absentee ballot. That provision is one Democrats have been vocal in opposing, including Indiana Democratic Party Vice Chair and Marion County Clerk Mila Eldridge. Mila, thank you for taking some time. What's your biggest issue with Senate Bill 353?
Let me just begin by saying that Hoosiers should not have to be election law experts in order to vote, in a free and fair election. My problem with Senate Bill 353 is I feel that it is going to cause confusion and have a major impact of voter confusion and intimidation for Hoosier voters, and especially for our Indiana senior communities. I'm just afraid that this new requirement for voters to provide their driver's license number or the last four digits of their social to vote absentee would be a huge issue for especially our voters, our senior voters, as I mentioned earlier, just because they've already dealt with COVID-19, right? And I just think that we should be making voting easier for voters instead of making it difficult.
I know that you sent out a release earlier in the week, and I want to quote you on that. You said Hoosiers should not have to be election law experts. In what way would they have to be, in your words, election law experts to be able to vote?
Well, just knowing all the ins and outs of the election law. I mean, we have statutes, right? And we have election law experts. I feel that Hoosiers shouldn't have to know all the laws regarding how to and how to vote. Like that should not be their responsibility. A voter's responsibility is being able to cast a ballot in an election, you know, that they care about. They want people that they want to vote. That's all they care about at the end of the day, you know, is voting and making sure that it's fair, that the process is fair.
In your opinion, Mila, and I thank you again for taking some time, is this bill similar to the one in Georgia? And if so, how?
In my opinion, the differences between Senate Bill 353 and Georgia's law is Indiana Senate Bill 353 only focuses on the absentee ballot application process. It doesn't criminalize something as humane as handing a bottle of water to a voter, right, that has been standing in line to cast their ballot. You know, Georgia was just more direct with its voter suppression tactics. Indiana, Republicans appear to want to just confuse and intimidate voters as they try to fulfill their constitutional right to vote. And it's just that simple.
So do you think it is similar?
I do think it's similar. Again, because you're putting in a barrier requiring a new requirement for voters to have to provide their driver's license number or the last four digits of their social because they choose to vote early or to vote by mail. Absentee voting, voting prior to election day. That's what that means. And why is that requirement necessary? Why do we need to know a voter's driver's license number or the last, four digits of their social? And how about this? Some voters are not going to be willing to share their personal information, right? Or maybe they don't feel comfortable with sharing their driver's license number or the last four digits of their social. So again, too, I'm just super concerned about our senior voters and some voters that, hey, perhaps are maybe older than you and I, and they no longer drive, right? So they may not have a driver's license number. Or how about, again, as I stated, their handwriting isn't legible and the numbers are transposed.
Right.
And that would be a problem.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because it's my job and I feel inclined to do so. The other side's going to listen to this interview and they're going to say, why shouldn't people have to prove who they are to cast their ballot? They have to do so for things like buying liquor, going to a ball game, etc. Your response?
Voting is someone's right and their duty, and it should not be difficult. It's unfair to put barriers in place to make it difficult for voters to cast their ballots.
Fair enough. Okay. Mila Eldridge, we'll leave it there. Thank you again for taking some time on this afternoon.
Thank you.
And coming up, the president's $3 trillion infrastructure plan and the complaints that it goes way beyond traditional infrastructure. Our political experts are standing by to talk about it next. And welcome back to All Indiana Politics on this Sunday as we welcome in Republican Whitley Yates and Democrat Brian Gaddy. Good to see you both. Thank you for taking some time. We'll start with infrastructure, guys. It's getting a lot of talk nationally and locally. We've watched President Biden this week roll out his $3 trillion infrastructure plan, and we've seen Republicans criticize many parts of it. And Whitley, I want to start with you here. Polls show this has broad support among voters around the country, including Republican voters.
Absolutely. I don't think the issue is that there needs to be an infrastructure plan. I think that that is very important and something that is necessary. But like Indiana, we have a fully funded infrastructure plan. And I think his is a Trojan horse just packed with a bunch of special interests that have absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure and roads. And so being able to have a plan that you can compromise on with both the right and the left is going to be important. And I think some of the things that the Republicans have problems with, such as a corporate tax rate, are very viable, especially coming off of a pandemic. We need to be thinking about how these decisions are going to impact our businesses.
Brian?
Well, once again, the Republicans, they always seem to care about spending when there's a Democrat in the White House. But when former President Trump was supposed to do something about infrastructure, I think he even had an infrastructure week. Never really did anything about infrastructure. But President Biden's doing something about infrastructure. He's going to prepare our country to compete with China, who has invested a lot more in their infrastructure in recent years than we have here in the United States. So it's going to definitely prepare us for a future green energy economy. Obviously putting potentially millions of American workers back to work, steel workers, and that's going to actually benefit Indiana, because Indiana, we're one of the top manufacturing states in the country. And obviously having Mayor Pete as Secretary of Transportation is a great thing, because obviously a great Hoosier and a great Hoosier Democrat. He's going to help make sure that not just Indiana, but the Midwest in general will benefit from this and help rebuild America, build back better.
Brian, I want to push back a little bit, because one of the ways he says he's going to pay for this thing is by raising the corporate tax rate from, what, 21 to 28%. Good or bad?
Good. I mean, what's wrong with raising the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%? And you got corporations, some of them don't even pay taxes at all. So I don't think the average American's going to be concerned that Eli Lilly has to pay a little bit more in taxes. I think the fact that we'll be putting potentially millions of Americans to work rebuilding our country, that's what they're going to care about.
Whitley, to Brian's point, some of the top corporations, we want to let Whitley get in here real quick, Brian. To his point, some of the top corporations pay no tax right now.
And I'm trying to figure out where he's coming from, because the truth of the matter is, our society, we're coming off of a pandemic, loss of jobs, businesses that went out of business that we'll never see again. And so the first thing that we're going to do out the gate is increase taxes for corporations. The corporations that were able to make it through the pandemic are the ones that we really need to rely on now to keep those doors open, right? To get money back in their pocket so that they can continue hiring people and not laying them off. So hearing him say that he wants to increase taxes on corporations that are still around, that's a little scary to me. Furthermore, right, to 28%, we're going up 7%. He's saying it's okay if we tax companies like Eli Lilly higher, but I don't think that that's the move. And the reason why the steel workers and people who are working on these labor jobs are out of business are because of the pandemic and the pipeline that the president shut down. So yeah, he does need to put some people back to work. I do agree with that, but I don't think that we should be taxing corporations at a high level when we're still dealing with the pandemic, and we're dealing with people who have lost their jobs and corporations who are no longer in business due to the pandemic. I think that the tax is an abomination, and that's not the way the American people should go.
Okay, fair enough. We'll change topics now. We also talked election law changes earlier on. The House has stripped some of the more controversial provisions of absentee balloting. Brian, we'll stick with you here on this one. Many Democrats compare this to what's happening in Georgia, and we're talking specifically for here in Indiana. Is that a stretch? Is this potential bill comparable to the one in Georgia?
I don't think it's a stretch, but we got to ask ourselves this question: why are the Republicans doing this? And again, this is all predicated on the big lie that former President Trump perpetrated and kept promulgating all throughout the country. Oh, the election was stolen from me. Well, he lost the election fair and square. And it just seems like Republicans, if the election is fair and square, voters can vote, they lose.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Whitley, just respond real quickly, 30 seconds, last.
Oh, it is a stretch with the longest of arms. The truth of the matter is we want free, fair, and secure elections, and we're going to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to make sure that that happens. And so making sure that our laws are secure and making sure that people can vote freely is important.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Brian, Whitley, always good to see you. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
Take All Indiana Politics on the go with you. Download our podcast now. Part of the All Indiana Podcast Network and allindianapodcastnetwork.com.
And thank you for joining us for All Indiana Politics on this Sunday. We'll be back here next Sunday morning, 9:30, right here on Wish TV. Have a great rest of your weekend.